This is one of those rare albums that I stumbled across completely by chance. It came up on my kind of For You page on Spotify, and I'm like, I'll give it a try. I love the name of the band, so let's find out what this is all about. Illusory Walls by The World is a Beautiful Place and I Am No Longer Afraid to Die. That is one heck of a name for a band. Illusionary Walls is the fourth studio album from The World is a Beautiful Place and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die. And this is actually the first record after the departure of the guitarist vocalist Tyler Bessie and Dylan Ballet. I hope so. As well as, unfortunately, the death of the founding member, Tom Diaz. So there's been a lot of personnel change up on this album, but this is the only album I've heard from them, so I'm not quite sure how it compares to their past albums. This is also kind of an homage, a little bit of a concept maybe, to Dark Souls, the video game. At least that's where the inspiration for the title of this album, as well as the single Invading the World of the Guilty as a Spirit of Vengeance. And what I will say right off the get-go is that the music that's being presented is very like indie experimental art pop. I particularly love this style of music. It's very like almost post rock in that sense. Like I'm getting flavors of Explosions in the Sky. I'm getting flavors of Mogwai. I would even go so far as to say I'm getting flavors of like the Pineapple Thief in a progressive rock sense, especially some of their earlier works. They're much more concentrated on capturing atmosphere and emitting a feeling rather than trying to pump out singles. And I really, really appreciate that. So from a top eye view of this album, I love the first two tracks off of this. Afraid to Die and Queen Sophie for President are jaw-dropping beautiful. Specifically the first track of Afraid to Die. I'm actually getting flavors of how Between the Buried and Me start their albums. Like I'm looking at the beginning of the Parallax Part 2. I'm looking at Colors of building the track up to this brilliant and beautiful crescendo that really anchors the track down. And it got me so excited for the rest of the music that's found within it. Like that first track of Die Afraid starts off very similar to something that I would hear from Explosions in the Sky, or even something that we'd hear from Oh Hiroshima from their album In Silence We Yearn. It's very almost shoegaze in that effect, but as the song progresses and as the song builds up, we get this such a cathartic and satisfying crescendo. And even though this track is 3 minutes or so, I could have easily been engrossed in this track for a good 10 minutes. And then from there we go right into Queen Sophie for President. That feels much more like a kind of like an art pop outfit. Like it's very bouncy. It's very like against the curve in that sense. Like I'm getting feelings for like almost like a dream synth pop. I love the chugging bass that like solidifies this track into place. Love how bouncy and fun and tangible this track is. Like I said, the first two tracks of Afraid to Die and Queen Sophie for President give a brilliant 1-2 punch of about 6.5 minutes that I cannot help but love. I'm going to skip ahead because I really want to talk about what I love about this album. This album closes with two epic length tracks. We have Infinite Josh being the 10th song at 15.5 minutes, as well as Fewer Afraid at almost 20 minutes. And man, my heart gushes for tracks like this. I love that these guys are really giving themselves permission to explore the space. They are creating such brilliant textured music to allow them to drift off into this space rock essence. It's a perfect marriage of this post-rock shoegaze space rock outfit that allows us to just drift off and allow the music to really build itself up. By the time Infinite Josh ends after the 15.5 minutes, I feel myself so released of energy, and it's such a cathartic essence that by the time Fewer Afraid starts, I am ready to be filled up again. And Fewer Afraid really does that. It builds itself up in such a brilliant way. That building and layering and texturizing of music to such a brilliant extent. And I love how this album finishes off. Unfortunately, we have about 7 tracks that aren't quite as good. Now, I don't mean that they're bad. I'm just saying that the brilliance that were the first two tracks and the last two tracks are on such a higher level that the rest of the album does suffer because of it. And that's not necessarily saying, again, that these tracks themselves are bad. Invading the world of the guilty as a spirit of vengeance, the third track has flavors of more of like a pop punk band, or even like more of a contemporary rock band, like Coheed and Cambria definitely comes to mind, in more of like a prominent guitar work. Blank Drone, this track that follows this up, is a really great, just kind of like almost shoegaze overtoned atmospheric track that just provides a great kind of passing of the baton between two Goliaths of a track. We Saw Birds Through the Holes in the Ceilings, the fifth track, is a fantastic kind of 1-2 punch of a single track where it starts off in more of a, almost like an adult contemporary ballad, like something that, say, Train would do, but then shifts very quickly into a much more heavy, driven rock track that we would get from maybe like even Panic at the Disco. And the same can kind of be said about Died in the Prison of the Holy Office. I feel like at this point, the sixth track, I'm really kind of getting the essence of what the band was going for these mid tracks. They don't really do a whole lot for me. I feel like we're kind of treading the same ground, specifically in Died in the Prison of the Holy Office, as we had for the second half of We Saw Birds Through the Holes in the Ceiling. Now, I do love the kind of climactic ending of Died in the Prison of the Holy Office. I like how it kind of builds us all together. And again, this is where they're channeling a little bit more of like the emo, more theatrical sense of that. Like I can feel flavors of either Panic at the Disco or Fall Out Boy, just having this kind of extra little bit of a teeth by the end of there. And so by the time we get to Your Brain is a Rubbermaid, the track that follows this, the transition is very seamless. And if I'm not sitting down and looking at the track runtime, you could almost say that track 6 and 7 are the same one. I love, again, how the track takes its time and builds itself up. And I love where the track goes by the second half. It provides a really great cathartic of all the tension that they've been building up into that point. But by the time we get into the 8th track, the second blank, but this time Worker, it feels kind of like we're just treading water at this point. Like the band doesn't quite know what to do with all this time that they still have on their hands before we get into the big 2 final tracks on there. So it does feel as though it's a little bit of a placeholder in that sense, which really doesn't even need to be held. And the final track that I want to talk about is the 9th track, the one before the big 2 epic tracks of Trouble. This one definitely feels as though it's the single off the album. It feels like a marriage of a lot of the essences that we've had before, but it feels like some of the more dour moments of like the 2000s rock, like something from like Billy Talent or Alexis on Fire, without the big teeth that we found within it. A little bit more on the indie side of that. It's still good, but it's probably the weakest track off of it. There's no real risk that's being taken off of this, such that like Your Brain is Rubber or Died in the Prison or even We Saw the Birds, where at least they tried something a little bit different in that the song eventually did open up into something very special and very unique. This track just kind of, again, much like the blank Worker, it feels like it's just treading water and doesn't quite know where to go. Honestly, if they had taken these like 7 tracks in the middle after the Queen's Sophie for President, make like 2 or 3 other tracks in maybe the 5 to 10 minute range, we probably would have had a much more cohesive album rather than 2 amazing jaw-dropping great tracks followed by 3 or 4 good, serviceable, I had a good time while I was in it, but definitely not as good as the first 2 tracks, then followed by tracks that I'm like, why am I still here? That then lead into 2 of the best tracks that I've heard this year. At the end of the day, this album is a little bit of a mixed grab bag. On the one hand, as I've already mentioned, this album holds 4 of the best tracks I've heard all year. But on the other hand, it's such a slog to get through all those other, I hate to say it, but B-rated kind of indie, rock, experimental shoegaze music that I don't know if I would necessarily sit down to listen to the entirety of this album. I would much rather just listen to the first 2 tracks, kind of, disconnect from the album, do my own thing to come back and listen to those last 2 tracks. So Rating this album's a little bit of a hard part because definitely there are tracks on here that are full-on masterpieces, but there are also tracks on here that I would probably skip. What I will do is I'll probably cut it down the middle and give it a pretty serviceable rating, which is what I'll say. Illusory Walls by The World is a Beautiful Place and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die is one that I would definitely pick up in physical format. If I saw this at a record store, I would have no problem picking this up in a physical format, even though I still think that the biggest problem of this album is that it's a little too long. But what it did do is it opened up the band for me and now allows me to discover The World is a Beautiful Place and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die. But that's about it for Illusory Walls. So what did you guys think of this album? Have you listened to it? If you have, let me know what you thought about it. If you loved it, if you hated it, whatever you thought, let me know by commenting down below. And if you like what you see and you want to help support me, consider donating to my Patreon. I've left the link down below. Even $1 a month goes a long way. Get your name at the end credits, and depending on the rate that you donate, you can get videos from me, or live streams, or any kind of fun things. But yeah, that's about it. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.